Buried within the shadows of history lie files that were never meant to be opened, testimonies that were silenced, and crimes so disturbing that even victors of the war chose to bury them. World War II is often recalled through the lens of battles and liberation. Yet behind the smoke and rubble existed a darker ledger, an archive of atrocities scrubbed from memory, hidden in vaults and disguised under false names. These are not the well-known horrors that echo through textbooks, but the concealed chapters, atrocities erased by those who committed them, and sometimes by those who claim to fight against them. The story you are about to hear has been reconstructed from fragments, declassified memos, intercepted communications, survivor testimonies, and redacted trial records pried open decades too late. These are the 5 disturbingly feared crimes of the Second World War that were hidden away. Crimes that reveal not only the cruelty of regimes but the complicity of powers who covered them to protect secrets of their own. Listen carefully, for the truth once spoken cannot be forgotten. Chapter 1. The Erased Files of Unit 731. In the frigid expanses of Manchuria during the 1930s and 1940s, a fortress of red brick and steel chimneys rose under a false banner of epidemic prevention. Official documents named it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, a secret complex designed not to heal, but to dissect, infect, and destroy. At its helm stood General Shiro Ishii, a physician whose charisma masked a vision more terrifying than most military planners could conceive. His obsession was biological warfare, a weapon of invisible contagion that could cripple armies without firing a shot. Within the sealed perimeters of Pingfang, just outside Harbin, trains unloaded prisoners of war, political captives, and ordinary villagers. They entered through iron gates and never returned. Their identities disappeared, erased in the ledgers, replaced only with coded designations that reduced human beings to experimental subjects. Testimonies gathered decades later described rows of operating tables where men and women were strapped down, their screams muffled by the buzzing hum of crude surgical lamps. Anesthetics were deliberately withheld. Ishii's researchers wanted to watch the precise unfolding of biological processes: frostbite tearing flesh from bone, plague swelling lymph nodes, cholera ravaging the gut. Prisoners were injected with pathogens, then dissected alive so that organs could be studied before death distorted their tissues. Guards stood watch, rifles slung at their sides, ensuring no one escaped. The stench of burned remains drifted across nearby fields as corpses were disposed of in incinerators, their ashes scattered without record. For the local population, the smoke from Unit 731 became a silent signal of death. In 1940, reports surfaced of ceramic bombs tested on villages in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces. These bombs carried plague-infected fleas, carefully bred in Unit 731's laboratories. Witnesses described swarms descending upon unsuspecting towns, leaving behind fields of corpses. Japanese records, when they survived, referred to these strikes as field sanitation trials. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, yet the operations were kept beyond the eyes of Tokyo's own general public. Villages were erased, maps redrawn, and survivors silenced. What was presented to the world as famine or disease outbreaks was, in truth, deliberate weaponization of nature itself. By 1943, Ishii's program had expanded into a network of facilities, Units 100, 1644, and others scattered across occupied territories, each experimenting with poisons, pathogens, and mutilation. Allied intelligence had whispers of such horrors. Reports trickled in from Chinese resistance fighters and Soviet informants, but were dismissed as propaganda by Western analysts wary of exaggeration. It was not until the Red Army swept into Manchuria in August 1945 that the world glimpsed the monstrous scale of Unit 731. Laboratories still reeked of chemicals, surgical tools lay scattered across abandoned operating theaters, and cages of diseased animals howled in the wreckage. Yet even then, the truth was smothered by politics. As Japan surrendered, American intelligence officers moved swiftly. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, recognized the military value of Ishii's research. Orders were dispatched to secure documents before Soviet forces could claim them. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and his colleagues surrendered their findings to US authorities. Autopsy records, plague cultivation methods, frostbite experiment results, all were packed into crates and shipped to Fort Detrick. Maryland, the heart of America's biological warfare program. Instead of standing trial in Tokyo alongside other war criminals, Ishii faded into obscurity, living under quiet protection until his death in 1959. His crimes were buried not to preserve honor, but to preserve knowledge. The Soviet Union, enraged at this arrangement, held its own tribunal in Khabarovsk in December 1949. 12 captured Japanese officers were placed on trial, accused of crimes against humanity through biological warfare. Testimonies detailed the grotesque experiments at Unit 731, the plague bombings in China, and the deliberate infections inflicted upon prisoners. Sentences ranged from 2 to 25 years in labor camps. The world, however, largely ignored the proceedings, dismissing them as Soviet propaganda during the opening years of the Cold War. The West preferred silence, for acknowledging the Soviet evidence meant admitting their own complicity in covering Ishii's bargains. The fragments that remain today emerged from declassified documents, memos stamped with top secret and declassified decades later. In one 1947 cable, American officers debated whether exposing Ishii's crimes would compromise national interests. Another document referenced code-named shipments of epidemic materials arriving under armed guard. Even now, many of these files are redacted. Black ink blotting out the names of operatives and programs that absorbed Unit 731's findings into US laboratories. What is clear is that truth was sacrificed for power, and the victims of Pingfang were abandoned by history. Survivors' testimonies, preserved at great personal risk, add the human cost to these shadowy files. A former guard spoke of prisoners left in freezing chambers until limbs blackened with frostbite, their flesh then thawed and refrozen repeatedly. A nurse recalled how she was ordered to inject cholera into a captive, only to watch helplessly as he convulsed for hours before his organs were harvested. These voices, trembling yet defiant, echo across decades of enforced silence. They remind us that what was labeled as research was in fact methodical butchery, designed to weaponize the human body as a battlefield. Today, much of the site at Pingfang has been erased. Portions of the compound were demolished, fields planted over the ruins. Yet beneath the soil, remnants still surface. Surgical tools, broken vials, fragments of bone. In Harbin, a museum stands in memory of Unit 731's victims, though many exhibits remain incomplete because official archives were destroyed or remain locked in foreign vaults. Scholars comb through declassified papers, piecing together timelines from redacted transcripts and intercepted Soviet intelligence. Each fragment reveals not only the scale of Ishii's crimes, but the depth of international willingness to suppress them. The erasure of Unit 731 is more than an attempt to hide atrocity. It is evidence of how power rewrites history. By protecting Ishii, American intelligence shielded themselves from scrutiny and advanced their own weapons programs. By dismissing Soviet trials, Western governments silenced survivors and turned their suffering into propaganda battles. And by burying these files for decades, both East and West ensured that justice for the thousands who perished in Pingfang was denied. Only now, with archives slowly opening, does the full shadow of Unit 731 begin to stretch into the light. Yet the most disturbing question remains unanswered. How much of Unit 731's research still influences present-day military and medical science? Were the pathogens once nurtured in Ishii's laboratories truly destroyed? Or did they migrate into classified Cold War arsenals, reborn under new codenames? In this uncertainty lies the enduring fear that the erased files of Unit 731 were never truly erased, only rebranded, and that their legacy continues to shape secrets hidden far beyond the battlefields of the Second World War. Chapter 2: The Forbidden Atrocities of Operation Tannenberg. On the first day of September 1939, as German tanks rolled across the Polish frontier and the skies thundered with Luftwaffe bombers, a second war unfolded in silence. It was not fought with armored divisions or artillery barrages, but with lists, files, and pre-written orders. Its name was Operation Tannenberg. To the outside world, the invasion of Poland was justified as a campaign of territorial reclamation. Inside the sealed corridors of the Reich Security Main Office, however, Operation Tannenberg was understood as something darker, a systematic decapitation of Poland's intellectual and cultural life. It was the opening act of a campaign to erase a nation not only from maps, but from memory. Months before the Wehrmacht crossed the border, Gestapo officers compiled exhaustive rosters of Polish elites. Known as the Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, or Special Prosecution Book Poland, these registers contained more than 61,000 names: professors, judges, priests, resistance leaders, journalists, and members of the intelligentsia. The lists were drawn from meticulous research, aided by German minority organizations in Poland and industrial cartels eager to seize Polish assets. When war began, Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads attached to the SS, carried these lists as if they were military maps. Each name was a target. Each target represented a voice silenced before it could inspire resistance. In the first weeks of occupation, forests near Bydgoszcz, Piaśnica, and Palmyry became killing grounds. Victims were marched in silence, lined against ravines, and shot into shallow pits. Villagers were forced to witness, then warned that silence was their only survival. Testimony gathered decades later speaks of executions carried out in the dead of night, the sounds of gunfire muffled by the dense trees. Survivors describe the chilling calm of SS officers, reading from prepared rosters, checking names, and marking lists before pulling the trigger. This was not random terror. It was a calculated extermination designed to eliminate Polish leadership and leave the country leaderless, ready to be absorbed into Hitler's empire. British intelligence knew fragments of what was happening. At Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts intercepting German police radio traffic noticed strange references to intelligence action. Intelligence action. The word appeared repeatedly in coded transmissions, often followed by numerical tallies of those executed. Churchill was informed, yet he ordered the reports classified. Revealing the information risked exposing the Allies' success in cracking Enigma, a secret too valuable to compromise in 1939. Thus, while civilians were shot by the hundreds, their fates remained hidden behind Britain's silence. The very technology that could have broadcast their suffering instead buried it under layers of secrecy. By the spring of 1940, Operation Tannenberg had claimed more than 50,000 lives. But its true scale is impossible to measure, for records were deliberately destroyed. German cartels and bureaucrats profited from the purge, seizing Polish factories, universities, and estates. In Warsaw, cultural institutions were stripped bare, libraries emptied, manuscripts confiscated, archives carted away under SS guard. Scholars who could have rebuilt Poland's identity were gunned down in cellars or vanished into concentration camps like Stutthof and Dachau. The genocide of culture was as deliberate as the genocide of people. Soviet archives, declassified in the 1990s, revealed another disturbing layer. As part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet NKVD officers also drew up lists of Polish elites in territories they occupied after September 1939. Many of these lists overlapped with those in German possession. Historians now believe some records may have been exchanged, or at least exploited by both regimes, as each sought to eradicate potential centers of resistance. In Lvov, Wilno, and other cities under Soviet control, professors and judges disappeared into the Gulag system, mirroring the fates of their colleagues executed by the Nazis. It was a grim choreography of extermination, coordinated through silence, with Poland's brightest minds trapped between two totalitarian machines. After the war, the story of Tannenberg was largely erased. During the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors focused on the larger machinery of the Holocaust, pushing the early crimes in Poland into the shadows. Allied governments feared that emphasizing the killings of intellectuals would draw uncomfortable parallels to their own post-war expulsions and border changes. NATO intelligence agencies quietly gathered captured SS files, locking them away in archives where they would remain for decades. When families of the murdered professors and priests petitioned for recognition, they were told records had been lost in the chaos of war. But the earth does not lie. In the 1960s and 1970s, Polish villagers began uncovering mass graves in forests once used as execution grounds. Skulls bearing bullet holes were found tangled in roots, rosaries clutched in skeletal hands. These discoveries forced reluctant governments to acknowledge what had been hidden. Yet even then, the term Tannenberg rarely appeared. The crimes were described as isolated massacres, never as part of the wider, premeditated extermination. Only in the archives of the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland, decades later, did fragments of the Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen resurface, their pages stained, names crossed out in black ink. One surviving witness, a young student in 1939, later recounted how his professor disappeared one morning after being summoned by the Gestapo. Days later, the professor's name was found among those shot in Palmyry. His notes, confiscated by German officers, were never recovered. Another villager remembered watching carts filled with bound prisoners entering the woods near Piaśnica, only to return empty hours later. These memories, repeated across countless towns, stitched together the unrecorded story of Operation Tannenberg. Each fragment of testimony defies the deliberate silence imposed by official archives. The forbidden nature of Tannenberg lies not only in its brutality, but in its erasure. It was not a chaotic byproduct of war, but a designed mechanism of genocide, orchestrated with bureaucratic efficiency and suppressed by post-war politics. The SS ensured that intellectual resistance was annihilated before it could form. The Allies, through silence, allowed the details to remain buried. And the Soviets, eager to conceal their own purges of Polish elites, contributed to the vanishing of records. What should have been central to the story of the Second World War became a footnote, its files hidden, its victims forgotten outside of local memory. Today, historians who piece together the atrocity face redacted documents, shredded archives and witnesses long dead, yet the fragments remain undeniable. Operation Tannenberg was not simply an opening salvo. It was the blueprint for broader campaigns of extermination across occupied Europe. The methods of list-making, targeted killings, and cultural destruction foreshadowed the final solution. The crime was so deliberate, so calculated, that even decades later, its silence feels enforced. The forests of Poland remain filled with unmarked graves, their soil holding secrets once buried by both victors and vanquished. The question now is whether those secrets will ever be fully uncovered. How many names were erased? How many documents remain sealed in NATO archives marked classified even in the 21st century? And how many of Poland's lost voices, its teachers, writers, scientists, remain buried not only in the ground, but in files deliberately hidden from public view? Operation Tannenberg stands as one of the most forbidden crimes of the war, a campaign of intellectual extermination concealed beneath the smoke of invasion. It is a chapter designed to be forgotten, yet its echoes resurface each time a mass grave is uncovered, each time a redacted file is pried open, each time silence is broken by the persistence of memory. Chapter 3: Hidden Tortures of the Kempeitai Regime. In the shadows of Japan's expanding empire during World War II, there existed a force so feared that its very name became a whisper of terror across Asia, the Kempeitai. Officially, it was the military police of the Imperial Japanese Army. In practice, it was an intelligence agency, a counterinsurgency force, and a secret police organization fused into one. Wherever Japanese troops marched, the Kempeitai followed. They were not bound by conventional rules of war, nor were they restrained by military codes of honor. Their authority was absolute, their methods ruthless, and their presence synonymous with suffering. Behind every occupied city, Shanghai, Singapore, Manila, Rangoon, stood hidden interrogation chambers and prison blocks under their control, where untold thousands vanished into silence. The Kempeitai answered directly to the Ministry of War in Tokyo, but their true loyalty was to fear itself. Their operations extended beyond policing soldiers to controlling civilians, suppressing dissent, and extracting intelligence with methods too brutal to record in official logs. In Shanghai, records smuggled to Chinese resistance groups spoke of secret detention centers, where prisoners were crammed into windowless rooms, beaten until unconscious, revived with buckets of cold water, and beaten again. Electrical wires were attached to tongues, ears, and genitals, the current applied until convulsions racked the body. This method, survivors later testified, left no visible scars, but broke minds and spirits. It was called questioning with intensity, a phrase designed to sanitize systematic torture. One of the most feared techniques was the so-called knee-splitting method. Prisoners were forced into a kneeling position on hardwood floors for hours, sometimes days, while heavy bamboo poles were pressed against the joints. The excruciating pressure shattered kneecaps, leaving captives permanently crippled. Others were subjected to water torture, what modern accounts would recognize as waterboarding. Victims were restrained while water was poured into their nostrils and mouths, creating the sensation of drowning. Many suffocated. Others confessed to crimes they had never committed simply to make the ordeal stop. The Kempeitai thrived on fear, using it as a weapon to control populations and suppress underground networks before they could gain strength. Civilians suspected of harboring Allied sympathies or aiding resistance groups were seized without warrant. Once inside Kempeitai custody, they ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. No trial, no defense, no contact with families. Their names disappeared into unmarked registers. In Singapore, entire neighborhoods lived under the shadow of their raids. Eyewitness accounts recall the sound of boots in the dead of night, doors kicked open, and men dragged away at gunpoint. In some cases, entire families were taken, the Kempeitai accusing them of collective guilt. What awaited them in the cellars of the YMCA building, converted into a prison, was terror crafted into policy. Captured Allied soldiers were not spared. Australian and British prisoners of war reported savage interrogations, often lasting days. Some described bamboo slivers driven under fingernails. Others spoke of having their teeth shattered with rifle butts. The Kempeitai did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians when it came to extracting information. To them, pain was an instrument of truth. In the Philippines, captured guerrillas were executed after prolonged torture, their bodies displayed as warnings to others. The policy of collective punishment ensured that entire villages paid the price if even one man was accused of resistance. Executions were often staged in public squares, with the Kempeitai ordering townspeople to witness the fates of their neighbors. Fear, once instilled, became self-perpetuating. Reports of these atrocities reached Allied intelligence during the war. The Office of Strategic Services in Chungking received testimony from escaped prisoners and intercepted Japanese communications referencing special measures. These were understood to be euphemisms for torture, yet even as evidence mounted, little could be done. The Kempeitai's black sites were deeply embedded in occupied cities, shielded by Japanese military command. When the war ended, Allied occupation forces uncovered some of these facilities, their walls still stained, their cells filled with iron shackles and discarded instruments. Photographs of the YMCA building in Singapore with its cramped torture chambers were quietly archived. They were considered too inflammatory for widespread release during the fragile post-war rebuilding of Japan. What is perhaps most disturbing is what followed. Instead of dismantling the Kempeitai entirely, elements of its command structure were quietly absorbed into post-war intelligence operations. The United States, fixated on the looming Cold War against the Soviet Union, sought experienced counterintelligence officers who could aid in suppressing communist influence in Asia. Some former Kempeitai officers, their crimes documented but deliberately unprosecuted, were recruited into covert networks. Immunity was traded for knowledge. Their expertise in interrogation, surveillance, and counterinsurgency was repurposed under new authorities. Files detailing their wartime activities were marked classified, sealed in military archives, and left untouched for decades. Survivors who testified were ignored, their voices drowned out by the politics of Cold War realignment. The Kempeitai's hidden legacy thus stretches beyond World War II. Their methods, the calculated infliction of pain, the manipulation of fear, the silencing of dissent, became templates for future covert operations across Asia. The very officers who oversaw torture chambers in Singapore and Shanghai were later seen advising intelligence programs in the 1950s. This continuity ensured that the darkest practices of wartime repression did not end with Japan's surrender. Instead, they mutated, surviving in the shadows of Cold War intelligence. Today, scattered testimonies and declassified fragments provide a window into this concealed world. In one report preserved by the National Archives, a survivor described the cell where dozens were crammed so tightly they could not sit, left for days without food or water. Another spoke of being hung by the wrists until shoulders dislocated, a method referred to by guards as the parrot's perch. These accounts, once dismissed as exaggeration, align with photographs and skeletal remains recovered from execution sites. They confirm what was long whispered, that the Kempeitai built a system of cruelty designed not merely to punish, but to break the very will of those under occupation. The silence surrounding their crimes is itself a crime of history. Post-war tribunals focused on the grand architects of empire, Tojo, Yamashita, and their generals, while the Kempeitai, whose terror defined daily life in occupied Asia, were largely overlooked. Their files were scattered, many destroyed, others hidden under seals of classification. Families of the disappeared rarely received answers. For decades, Japanese schoolchildren were taught little to nothing about the true role of the Kempeitai, and those who tried to speak, survivors, local witnesses, or historians, often faced intimidation, discrediting, or the weight of indifference. But the truth lingers, impossible to erase. In Singapore, fragments of the YMCA prison still stand, preserved as a warning. In Manchuria, local archives hold testimonies written in trembling handwriting, describing what could not be spoken aloud. In Australia, veterans associations continue to compile reports of torture inflicted on captured soldiers, their testimonies corroborated by scars that never healed. These voices, though scattered, defy the silence that sought to erase them. They remind us that the Kempeitai was more than a police force. It was a machine of terror whose hidden tortures left scars across an entire continent. The question remains, how many of their files still lie sealed in archives, stamped, classified, locked away by governments that once found their knowledge too valuable to expose? And how many techniques, once born in the darkness of those cellars, still influence interrogation practices today, disguised under new names, but carrying the same legacy of fear? The hidden tortures of the Kempeitai are not only a relic of the past, they are a shadow that stretches into the present, a reminder that the instruments of cruelty, once invented, are rarely destroyed. They are simply hidden, waiting to be uncovered again. Chapter 4: Classified Massacre of the Lvov Professors. On the night of July 3, 1941, as German forces pushed deeper into Soviet-occupied Poland, the city of Lvov, today known as Lviv in Ukraine, fell under the control of the Wehrmacht. Tanks rumbled through cobblestone streets, and swastika banners unfurled over university buildings that had only weeks earlier borne Soviet insignia. To the citizens of Lvov, the shifting tide of occupation was nothing new. In September 1939, the Soviets had arrived, executing and deporting thousands of Poles under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, less than 2 years later, the Nazis had replaced them. But this new occupation began with an act so precise, so chillingly calculated, that it remains one of the most disturbing and concealed atrocities of the war: the massacre of the Lvov professors. Within days of entering the city, German Einsatzgruppe C, supported by members of the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, began rounding up the intellectual elite. Professors from Jan Kazimierz University, the Polytechnic, and other institutions were targeted. Their names had been marked in advance, appearing on lists prepared during the Soviet occupation. Historians later uncovered evidence that NKVD dossiers detailing Poland's leading academics had fallen into German hands after the Soviet withdrawal. Whether by accident or design, this overlap ensured that the professors of Lvov would not survive the transition of power. They were accused of harboring anti-German sentiments, of being potential leaders of resistance, of embodying the cultural backbone of Poland. In truth, they were killed for what they represented: knowledge, identity, and continuity. Testimonies gathered after the war describe how German soldiers arrived at professors' homes under cover of darkness. Families were ordered to remain inside as their fathers, husbands, and brothers were dragged away at gunpoint. Some were taken in groups of 10 or 20, others individually. They were loaded into trucks and transported to the Walker Hills just beyond the city's edge. There, under torchlight, they were forced to kneel before shallow pits. Shots echoed across the night, muffled by the forest. The professors' bodies tumbled into mass graves, buried hurriedly by soldiers before dawn. Among the victims were some of Poland's most brilliant minds: mathematicians, medical researchers, engineers, and writers. Their work was silenced in an instant, their legacies scattered in the ashes of war. The massacre was not random vengeance. It was part of a broader Nazi strategy known as the Intelligence Action, the elimination of Poland's intellectual class to prevent any organized resistance. What makes the Lvov atrocity uniquely haunting, however, is its dual erasure. The Soviets had already targeted many of the same figures during their 21 months of occupation. Professors were interrogated, arrested, or marked in NKVD records as elements to be liquidated. When the Nazis arrived, they exploited these files to complete the purge. Thus, the intellectual class of Lvov was crushed twice, first by Soviet surveillance, then by German bullets, and both regimes took steps to bury the evidence. During the post-war years, mention of the Lvov professors' massacre was rare. At the Nuremberg trials, the atrocity was overshadowed by larger, better documented crimes, Soviet prosecutors deliberately avoided the subject, fearing that any investigation would expose their own role in preparing lists of intellectual targets. Polish families who demanded recognition were met with silence. Archives in Moscow and Warsaw contained files, but they remained sealed for decades, stamped with classification marks. Even the locations of the mass graves were suppressed. Families were left to mourn in silence, often without knowing the precise fate of their loved ones. When fragments of the story finally emerged in the late 20th century, they did so through survivor testimonies and the painstaking work of local historians. A handful of witnesses recalled the night raids, the boots on stairwells, the barked German orders, the terror of families left behind. Some remembered professors being marched through the streets in their pajamas, spectacles still perched on their faces. Others recalled whispers that bodies had been buried in the Wolka Hills, though approaching the site was forbidden for years under Soviet control. It was only in the 1990s, after the fall of communism, that researchers began exhuming mass graves and identifying remains. The discoveries confirmed what had long been denied. The massacre was deliberate, systematic, and concealed by both Nazi and Soviet authorities. The most disturbing evidence lies in the archives themselves. In 1991, Polish historians examining declassified NKVD documents found references to anti-Soviet intellectual elements in Lvov, many of whom later appeared on German execution lists. The overlap was too exact to be coincidence. Scholars now argue that Soviet files, abandoned during their hasty retreat, provided the Germans with ready-made targets. This collaboration through silence, whether intentional or opportunistic, ensured the annihilation of an entire generation of Polish thinkers. It also explains why Soviet authorities worked so hard to erase the massacre from history. To acknowledge it risked revealing their own role in paving the way. The intellectual void left by the massacre was immeasurable. Poland lost leading figures in medicine, mathematics, literature, and the sciences. Research projects were abandoned midstream, manuscripts confiscated or destroyed, students left without mentors. The cultural wound persisted for decades, as post-war Poland struggled to rebuild without the guidance of its most accomplished scholars. Entire fields of study were set back a generation. The Nazis understood the power of erasing intellectual leadership, and they wielded it with chilling efficiency. Yet the massacre of the Lvov professors is more than a historical footnote. It is a case study in how atrocities are not only committed, but erased. Nazi officials destroyed most records of the killings, while Soviet censors ensured that even whispers of the crime were silenced. When families of the victims petitioned for memorials, their requests were denied or ignored. Only after the fall of the Iron Curtain did the truth begin to emerge, piece by piece, through exhumations, memoirs, and the release of declassified files. Still, many questions remain unanswered. How many professors were killed? How many names remain unrecorded? And what other documents still locked in classified archives could reveal the full extent of the operation? Today, memorials in Lviv honor the murdered professors, but their legacy remains incomplete. Their research, their writings, their contributions to global scholarship are fragments scattered by war. The massacre's concealment ensured that their memory faded outside of Poland. Their names rarely mentioned in international accounts of the war. This deliberate forgetting is perhaps the final cruelty inflicted upon them. Not only the theft of their lives, but the theft of their remembrance. The classified massacre of the Lvov professors is a reminder that war crimes are not only executed with bullets, but with silence. The destruction of records, the suppression of testimonies, the careful redaction of archives. These are weapons as potent as rifles. They deny justice, obstruct memory, and perpetuate ignorance. For decades, the massacre lay buried beneath propaganda, politics, and secrecy. Only now, with archives pried open and graves exhumed, does the full weight of the atrocity emerge. And with it comes a haunting question. If this massacre could remain hidden for so long, what other crimes of the Second World War still lie locked in classified files, waiting to resurface from the shadows? Chapter 5: Suppressed Secrets of Operation Keelhaul. As the guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, borders redrawn. Yet in the chaotic aftermath of victory, another operation began. One that remains among the most disturbing and hidden chapters of the war. It was not conducted by the defeated Axis powers. but by the victors themselves. Its codename was Operation Keelhaul. To understand its cruelty, one must recall the fate of countless refugees, prisoners of war, and civilians who, in the last desperate months of fighting, fled westward. They were men, women, and children who feared Soviet retribution, who saw the advancing Red Army not as liberators, but as executioners. They surrendered to British and American forces, believing they had escaped Stalin's wrath. Instead, they were betrayed. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed in principle that Soviet citizens liberated by Allied armies would be repatriated to the USSR. What was not discussed openly was the fate of those who were not Soviet citizens at all, but Poles, Ukrainians, Cossacks, and even anti-communist Russians who had fought alongside the Germans out of desperation or coercion. To Stalin, they were traitors, destined for execution or lifelong imprisonment in the gulags. To the Western Allies, bound by treaty and eager to maintain fragile cooperation, they were bargaining chips. Thus began one of the most forbidden episodes of forced repatriation in history. The mechanics of Operation Keelhaul were chillingly efficient. British and American troops received sealed orders to identify and segregate refugees deemed Soviet nationals. In Austrian valleys, in Bavarian camps, in Italian villages, Allied soldiers surrounded refugee settlements with barbed wire. Notices were posted promising relocation to safe zones. Families, reassured, climbed aboard trucks and trains. Only upon arrival at railheads did the truth emerge. Soviet NKVD officers awaited them, lists in hand. Prisoners were herded into boxcars bound for the east, many never seen again. Eyewitness accounts describe suicides on railway platforms, mothers clutching children as they hurled themselves beneath moving trains, men slitting their wrists rather than face repatriation. The horror unfolded not in the secrecy of enemy camps, but under the banners of Allied victory. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in May 1945 near Lienz, Austria, where thousands of Cossack soldiers and their families had surrendered to the British. They believed they would be resettled in Italy or given asylum. Instead, they were deceived, told they were attending a conference on their future. Once disarmed and gathered, they were forcibly marched to Soviet custody. Resistance was met with rifle butts and bayonets. Witnesses reported entire families throwing themselves into the Drava River rather than board trains east. Those who survived the handover were executed by Soviet firing squads or sent to labor camps in Siberia. British officers who oversaw the operation later admitted privately that they knew the fate awaiting the Cossacks, but followed orders regardless. The files describing these events were stamped, classified, and sealed for decades. American forces carried out similar repatriations in Bavaria and northern Italy. One OSS memorandum, declassified in the 1980s, described the operation as distasteful but necessary for Allied unity. Another War Office file referred to the refugees as politically undesirable elements, whose elimination served long-term stability. The language was bureaucratic, detached, concealing the human devastation beneath euphemism. Survivors who later recounted their ordeals spoke of betrayal more than brutality. They had fled Stalin's terror, only to be delivered into his hands by the very powers who proclaimed freedom and democracy. The moral stain of Keelhaul is not in the secrecy of its orders, but in the cold deliberation that sustained them. The secrecy was maintained with ruthless discipline. Journalists were barred from refugee camps during repatriations. Photographs were confiscated, letters censored. British and American soldiers who objected were threatened with court-martial. One British officer, horrified by what he witnessed, later wrote in his diary that the operation was the most shameful act of my life. His account, like many others, remained unpublished until long after the war. The public narrative of liberation and victory could not be tainted by revelations of forced handovers to Soviet death squads. Churchill and Roosevelt calculated that silence was a small price to pay for maintaining the alliance that had secured victory. In doing so, they consigned hundreds of thousands to oblivion. The numbers remain disputed. Some historians estimate that more than 2 million people were forcibly repatriated under Keelhaul and related operations between 1945 and 1947. Others argue the figure is lower, limited to several hundred thousand. The truth is obscured by the deliberate destruction of records. Many files remained classified well into the late 20th century, while others were shredded outright. Soviet archives, when opened in the 1990s, revealed transfer lists and NKVD reports confirming mass executions of returnees. These fragments, cross-referenced with survivor testimonies, paint a grim picture of betrayal on a scale rarely acknowledged in Western histories of the war. The legacy of Operation Keelhaul lingers in silence. For decades, it was excluded from textbooks, absent from commemorations, erased from the narrative of Allied victory. Survivors who spoke out were dismissed, accused of exaggeration or political bias. Only in the 1970s and 1980s did Western scholars begin piecing together the truth from declassified documents. By then, most witnesses were old or dead. Their voices, trembling with age, recounted scenes of despair that had never entered the official record. Mothers weeping as their children were dragged onto trucks, soldiers tearing off uniforms to avoid identification, priests begging for mercy before being clubbed unconscious. These testimonies reveal the human face of a crime long hidden behind the word repatriation. What makes Operation Keelhaul especially haunting is the complicity of those who claimed moral authority. Unlike the crimes of the Nazis or the atrocities of Imperial Japan, Keelhaul was not committed by regimes of tyranny, but by democracies claiming to defend freedom. The betrayal was not born of ideology, but of diplomacy, an agreement to appease Stalin at the expense of human lives. The Western Allies justified it as necessary for peace, yet the peace they secured was built upon mass deportation and silence. It is a reminder that even victors can commit atrocities when expedience triumphs over conscience. Today, memorials to the victims of Keelhaul are rare, scattered in small cemeteries in Austria and Italy. Few official governments have acknowledged the operation, and those that have offered only muted statements. The British National Archives still contain redacted files, their black lines obscuring names and orders. The US National Archives holds cables marked declassified, but heavily censored. The truth, though partially uncovered, remains fragmented, an uncomfortable shadow on the story of Allied triumph. Historians continue to demand full access, arguing that reconciliation requires exposure, not erasure. Yet the political cost of admitting that democracies orchestrated mass deportations remains high. The suppressed secrets of Operation Keelhaul force us to confront the darker side of victory. They remind us that history is written not only by the winners, but also by what winners choose to hide. The refugees betrayed in 1945 did not vanish because of battlefield defeat. They vanished because their existence was inconvenient to the powers shaping the post-war world. Their fate was sealed not by enemy fire, but by the ink of agreements signed at Yalta and the silence of those who enforced them. It is a silence that lasted decades, and even now, as fragments emerge, the full story remains incomplete. Operation Keelhaul stands as one of the most forbidden crimes of the Second World War precisely because it was committed in the name of peace. It reveals that justice was selective, that morality bent under the weight of politics, and that the line between liberator and oppressor can vanish in the shadows of diplomacy. For the victims, there was no justice, no recognition, no return, only exile, betrayal, and silence. And for the rest of us, the question remains: what other secrets, still sealed in archives, await discovery? Proof that even in moments of triumph, humanity is capable of unspeakable betrayal. The files are closed, the vault doors locked once more, but the echoes of what we have uncovered cannot be sealed away again. From the erased laboratories of Unit 731 to the forbidden massacres of professors and refugees, these were not isolated crimes, but calculated erasures, atrocities hidden not just by those who carried them out, but by the very powers who benefited from their silence. Each classified page reveals a disturbing truth, that history is not simply written by the victors, but curated, redacted, and often distorted to protect political interests. The shadows of these crimes stretch far beyond the war itself, lingering in Cold War diplomacy, in redacted files, and in the graves that remain unmarked across Europe and Asia. As listeners, you are now witnesses to fragments of a record that others tried to erase. The question is no longer whether these crimes occurred, but what else remains concealed. What other files still lie in hidden archives, waiting to resurface decades too late? And when they do, will the world finally confront them? Or will silence once again bury the truth? The answer, perhaps, lies in the next file yet to be opened,